February 1945, Vosges Mountains, eastern France. Snow blurs the treetops, radios crackle in frantic German. Scouts report enemy convoys entering the valleys from the south. Ammunition wagons, armored trucks, supply columns. And yet, no one sees them. Not a single Allied truck is captured, not a single supply line is bombed. Still, the German commanders hesitate, they argue, and then, against all logic, they order a tactical withdrawal. The soldiers curse under their breath, dragging artillery down icy paths. Only one detail keeps turning in the minds of the German scouts. Convoy markings burned into the mud, direction signs scratched on stones, chalk indicators on trees, barns, and frozen fences. Enough to suggest a larger army was coming. Enough to make grown men retreat. All of it was a lie. And the architect of that lie was 15 years old, a refugee boy with no homeland, no rifle, and nothing left to lose. War rarely notices children. It crushes them, relocates them, starves them, and leaves them to fend for themselves in the wreckage. But sometimes, very rarely, a child notices war. Not as generals see it, not as politicians argue it, but as patterns, as rhythms, as vulnerabilities that adults are too proud, too busy, or too blind to see. The boy's name, known to the few who remembered him, was Marek Zielinski. He had fled west with his mother in 1943 after the German occupation of eastern Poland broke apart his world. His father vanished in the early months of the invasion. His older brother joined a partisan band and never reappeared. Marek and his mother carried the last pieces of their life in 2 canvas bags and a bundle of documents that soon became worthless under occupation. By the time they reached the foothills of eastern France, winter had stripped the forests bare. Refugees were not welcome everywhere, food was scarce, suspicion even worse. The French villagers had seen many outsiders, and each year seemed to bring fewer of them back again. Marek had no plan for the future. No dreams. No certainty that tomorrow would contain shelter or bread. He ate from soup kitchens run by the church. He slept in a cowshed offered by a farmer who did not ask questions. His mother cleaned linen for wounded men and whispered prayers every night that none of the uniforms recognized her Polish accent. In war, adults learn caution. Children learn curiosity. From the first week in the mountains, Marek began noticing the strange choreography of occupation. German couriers on motorcycles passed through the villages every dawn, always in pairs. Scouting cars rolled through after snowfall, checking which roads thawed first. Supply trucks slowed at certain bends, because fuel leaked or engines strained or maps were unclear. Marek watched, he memorized. Not because he intended to fight, but because curiosity gave structure to a world that had stolen everything else. He learned the meaning of fresh tire tracks, the difference between boot prints that belonged to infantry or signal corps, and most importantly, how terrified even the occupiers were of making the wrong decision at the wrong time. War was not only blood and bullets. It was information. And information could frighten men more than rifles. The Vosges region in late 1944 and early 1945 was a tangle of forests, ravines, ruined farmhouses, and improvised front lines. Resistance activity grew bolder as Allied forces pushed from the south and west, but the outcome was never guaranteed. Germany still held strong positions, still commanded seasoned officers, still believed they could contain the advance long enough to negotiate. Villagers whispered that the Americans were close, 2 valleys away, maybe 3. Others claimed trains still brought German reinforcements from the Rhine. No one knew which version of the war was true. Marek stood between those uncertainties. Invisible, unimportant, free to observe what armed men overlooked. In the spring of 1944, before fleeing Poland, Marek had seen Soviet and Polish partisans use chalk signals, marks left on trees or stones to indicate safe paths, water sources, or meeting points. These signs were simple: triangles, arrows, dots, numbers. Meaningless to most adults. Now, in the French mountains, Marek wondered if Germans noticed such things too. He followed a patrol and watched two German scouts kneel to examine a circle drawn hastily in the dirt. The soldiers argued, one pointed north, the other southeast. They left confused and slightly afraid. Fear, Marek understood, did not require gunfire. Sometimes all it needed was suggestion. Suggestion could create possibility. Possibility could create doubt. And doubt could move armies. As 1945 approached, the war consumed itself. Germany was losing, but retreating was dangerous business. In these final months, the German command relied heavily on reconnaissance, scouts, signals, and field reports to anticipate Allied movement. This obsession with data became a weakness. Marek discovered it slowly, like a child noticing cracks in a wall. German scouts recorded everything: snow depth, traffic on roads, fresh wagon tracks, abandoned crates, burned fire pits. To the untrained eye, these details were nothing. To a retreating army, they were clues, proof that an enemy supply route existed or that reinforcements were coming. Marek began experimenting. It started with chalk. One evening he found a stub of white chalk near the schoolhouse. He traced a small arrow onto the back of a wooden fence, nothing more than a child's doodle. But the next morning, a German scout paused, stared at it, and scribbled notes. 2 hours later, 3 officers returned and argued over a map. No one questioned whether a child might have drawn it. In war, adults search for complexity, even when simplicity stares them in the face. Soon Marek added numbers. Clusters of 3 or 5. A circle around a dot. Marks that resembled convoy signals used by Allied forces on the Western Front. Marks Marek only knew because he overheard wounded soldiers in the barn discuss how supplies were directed in Italy. The Germans documented everything. Marek watched their patterns change. Communications slowed. Patrols doubled. The occupiers grew wary of roads where chalk arrows pointed. They studied empty crossroads as if expecting trucks to appear at any moment. Still, Marek did not intend to mislead an entire division. Not yet. He was playing a private game, curiosity against occupation. But war has a talent for noticing the smallest disturbances and turning them into consequences. The pivotal moment came when Marek discovered mud tracks. After a late thaw, the valley roads became soft. Carts and wagons left deep impressions. Marek realized that by dragging a wooden plank with iron nails, he could mimic the tread pattern of Allied supply wagons, patterns different from German truck tires. He tried it once. Just once. Under moonlight, while villagers slept and the mountain winds scraped through the pines. By sunrise, a German scouting unit reported fresh enemy supply movement toward the southern ridge. Men who had no reason to fear a refugee child now feared an army that did not exist. What Marek did not know, could not know, was how thin the German line really was. How exhausted their fuel reserves had become. Or how desperate their officers were to avoid encirclement by the Allies. A good lie requires 2 ingredients: a storyteller and a listener who is ready to believe. Marek was only one half of the equation. The war provided the other. For now, Marek's chalk arrows and phantom wagon tracks were still small, still silent. But silence was the weapon that frightened Germany most in those final months. Silence meant movement. Movement meant reinforcements. Reinforcements meant defeat. And Marek, without knowing it, was was about to make that silence deafening. By early February, the Vosges Mountains had become a patchwork of snow, mud, and abandoned farms. Refugees huddled in barns and cellars, watching from frost-covered windows as German convoys creaked along narrow roads. Marek moved like a shadow, clutching his chalk and a small plank, tracing paths in mud and snow with meticulous care. He had begun mapping imaginary supply routes, creating symbols and arrows that suggested Allied convoys moving through hidden valleys and side paths. Each mark was deliberate. A dash here, a triangle there, numbers indicating troop strength that existed only in his mind. To any casual observer, they were nothing more than scratches on the earth, but to German scouts trained to overanalyze, they were signals of an approaching force. Marek quickly noticed patterns in the enemy. Scouts reported back to officers not only what they saw, but what they expected to see. If a route looked used, they assumed trucks and troops were passing there. If a sign suggested a direction, they would check it repeatedly, wasting hours. Marek exploited this carefully, learning when to erase marks, when to deepen them, and when to leave tracks in the snow that implied heavy wagons had passed. One night he moved deeper into the forest and began drawing false crossroads and hidden supply depots, using old barns and ruined walls as waypoints. He even dragged broken crates and tree branches to simulate abandoned supplies. Every mark, every shadow, every footprint was carefully staged. By mid-February, German officers reported sightings of a well-supplied Allied column moving through the southern valleys. They detailed trucks, horses, and teams that did not exist. The scouts debated whether it was a diversion or a real threat. They doubled patrols, reinforced checkpoints, and even rerouted their own supply convoys to avoid the phantom roads. Marek realized the power of his deception. He felt a thrill, but also a quiet fear. If discovered, he knew what might happen. German soldiers had little patience for children in war zones. Refugees had been shot for much less. And yet he continued because he understood something fundamental. Fear is as fragile as snow, and sometimes the smallest impression can topple it. One evening, a local villager caught him at work. Madame Lemaitre, an elderly widow, had been observing Marek for weeks. She said nothing, just watched as he drew another set of arrows and numbers along the riverbank. When Marek finally looked up, she gave him a faint nod. It was the only acknowledgement he would receive, a quiet, dangerous approval. She understood that what he was doing could save lives or cost them all. By March, German scouts began avoiding certain valleys altogether. Marek's chalk markings had grown more elaborate. He had added symbols for fuel depots, artillery positions, and even phantom infantry divisions. Scouts recorded these, officers deliberated, and the army began adjusting troop movements based on what existed only in Marek's imagination. The boy's deception reached a critical moment when he targeted a key supply valley, heavily patrolled and vital to German logistics. Marek spent 3 nights preparing, dragging logs to simulate tracks, chalking directional arrows, placing broken crates to suggest abandoned munitions. By the 4th morning, a scouting party reported a fully operational supply line approaching from the north, complete with trucks and fuel wagons. Officers panicked. They held emergency meetings in ruined barns, shivering and cursing the unknown force. Orders were sent to withdraw artillery and infantry. Roads that Marek had never physically traveled now appeared too dangerous for the Germans to cross. And then it happened. Entire units began to retreat from the Vosges valleys. Tanks were relocated. Soldiers burned bridges behind them. Convoys moved at night, under pressure and confusion. The phantom supply route had created real movement. Marek, still a child, had manipulated an entire army's decisions with nothing but chalk, mud, and observation. But Marek's success did not go unnoticed. One German patrol, suspicious of the repeated reports, began to follow his tracks back into the forest. They saw footprints that did not match any known units, arrows carved into trees, and signs that indicated movement where none existed. The scouts grew uneasy, reporting unusual local interference to higher command. Marek had entered dangerous territory. One wrong step could expose him completely. It was the moment of highest tension so far. The boy who had survived occupation by observing patterns now faced the real risk of discovery by armed soldiers. Every night, he crouched under trees, heart hammering, listening to the crunch of boots in snow, wondering if this would be the night it ended. Yet Mek also realized something profound. His deception had a life of its own. The Germans were moving, strategizing, fearing, retreating, all because he had imagined a path in the snow. A 15-year-old refugee had become a ghost general, commanding an army without a word, without a weapon. The consequences of his actions were about to become undeniable. Entire valleys emptied of German troops, villages once at risk now breathed in fragile relief. Allies advancing from the west found less resistance. And Mek, still unseen, still unheard, watched the results of his carefully orchestrated illusion unfold. By mid-March 1945, Mek's phantom supply route had grown into a complex network that stretched across the valleys and ridges of the Vosges Mountains. Chalk arrows pointed to hidden depots, numbered symbols indicated imaginary platoons, and faint tracks in the mud suggested continuous movement of trucks and wagons. To any observer, it was a bustling operational network, but to Mek, it was a careful game of observation, precision, and nerve. The Germans had begun to adjust entire battalions based on his false information. Artillery positions were abandoned, patrol routes were altered, supplies meant for frontline units were rerouted, leaving gaps in their lines. For the first time in months, the Wehrmacht's advance appeared hesitant and disorganized, reacting not to real forces, but to a child's imagination. But the stakes escalated when a German officer of higher rank arrived to investigate the mysterious supply route. Hauptmann Vogel, a stern man in his early 40s, was meticulous and suspicious. He demanded that scouts verify each road, check every track, and determine the size of this phantom army. Under his scrutiny, even seasoned scouts began to doubt their own reports. The snow tracks led nowhere, the depots were empty, and yet the officers remained uneasy. Mek knew that Vogel's arrival meant danger. A misstep could expose him, and the boy understood the cost. Refugee children caught near military operations were often executed or sent to labor camps. Still, Mek pressed on, refining his illusions. He duplicated tracks, dragging planks in shifting patterns, erasing evidence when necessary, and adding new chalk arrows to redirect attention. Every night he worked silently, blending with the shadows of the forest. Then came the night that would define the success of his deception. Mek had observed that the Germans relied heavily on scouts traveling along the northern ridge to verify supply lines. He decided to create a diversion that would convince the enemy of a massive flanking maneuver. Using chalk, he drew complex intersecting arrows leading to a hidden valley. He placed small bundles of sticks and stones to simulate abandoned equipment, and even partially burned remnants of crates to suggest a recent unloading. By dawn, scouts reported the movement of Allied forces along this new route. The officers debated fiercely, ultimately concluding that a larger force was advancing than initially believed. They reinforced the flanks, pulled back artillery, and delayed their own resupply efforts. Mek, still in hiding, realized the full magnitude of what he had accomplished. He had manipulated the decisions of a trained army through nothing but observation, improvisation, and the power of suggestion. The following days brought tangible consequences. German forces retreated further from strategic positions, leaving villages exposed. Allied units advancing from the west encountered less resistance, and in some areas, they found roads cleared, artillery abandoned, and minimal opposition. Mek watched these developments from a distance, feeling a strange combination of fear, pride, and disbelief. He understood that he had played a role in shaping real events in the war, a role no one would ever suspect. Yet danger remained. Scouts were still in the forests, looking for signs of local interference. Rumors of a suspicious youth spread among the villages. Mek's identity was not yet discovered, but the risk of exposure grew daily. One misstep could unravel everything. One glance, one misinterpreted movement, one footprint in the wrong place could lead to his capture or worse. And then the Germans made a critical mistake of their own. Believing the phantom supply route to be heavily defended, they abandoned a key valley entirely, withdrawing units that could have blocked the Allied advance. Mek realized the true power of his deception. He had created strategic outcomes without firing a single shot, without commanding men, without holding territory. But Marek also understood the fragile nature of his success. Every mark he made, every track he simulated, was temporary. Snow would cover footprints, wind would erase chalk, and time would reveal reality. He needed to maintain the illusion until the Germans were fully convinced to retreat, and that meant working faster, smarter, and more daringly than ever before. The boy who had fled Poland with nothing but a bag of belongings was now a ghost general, orchestrating movements across mountains, valleys, and forests. And yet, despite the tension, one truth remained. He was still just a child, vulnerable, alone, and unseen by the very world he was shaping. The events that followed would test every skill Marek had learned, push him to the brink of exposure, and ultimately reveal the incredible scale of a single child's impact on the course of a battle. By late March, the Vosges Mountains were a theater of quiet chaos. German commanders, convinced of an approaching Allied column, scrambled to reposition troops, abandon key supply points, and protect flanks that did not exist. Orders were hurriedly transmitted down frozen roads, radios crackled with uncertainty, and scouts moved nervously, double-checking tracks that vanished into the forest. Marek's illusion had grown into a living network of fear, a system that the enemy believed in more than their own maps. But the stakes were higher than ever. Hauptmann Vogel, increasingly frustrated with inconsistent reports, decided to lead a direct reconnaissance mission himself. Accompanied by a small detachment of scouts, he ventured into the northern ridge, precisely where Marek had concentrated his most elaborate deception, intersecting chalk arrows, tracks dragged in parallel lines, and simulated supply depots built from old crates and tree branches. Marek knew the scouts would come that night. He crouched behind a collapsed barn, his breath fogging in the freezing air, his fingers clutching chalk and a small plank. Every sound was amplified, the distant crack of a branch underfoot, the soft murmur of voices, the hiss of wind through the trees. One wrong move and the illusion would collapse. One wrong move and he could be discovered. The German detachment entered the valley slowly, scrutinizing every mark, every footprint, every arrow carved into the bark. Marek held his breath as Hauptmann Vogel knelt to examine a chalk arrow leading toward a hollowed-out tree stump. Vogel's eyes narrowed. He scribbled notes into his field journal and signaled to his scouts. Possible Allied advance. Proceed with caution. For the Germans, the signs were convincing enough to postpone any aggressive advance. The officer's caution triggered a chain reaction. Units on neighboring ridges shifted positions. Artillery that could have fired on advancing Allied forces was pulled back. Even supply convoys were rerouted to avoid the valley Marek had fabricated. Marek realized then the full weight of his actions. An entire army was reacting to a child's chalk drawings and simulated tracks. It was exhilarating and terrifying. Every night, he adjusted the deception, adding fresh symbols, altering paths, and enhancing tracks to keep the Germans uncertain. His phantom supply route had become a self-sustaining force, a ghost army commanding real-world consequences. But deception carries risk, and the Germans were starting to sense anomalies. A few scouts noticed that some footprints did not match any known unit, and supply depots appeared abandoned. Whispers began to circulate, local interference, possible partisan activity, child involvement, but none of the officers could pinpoint the source. They only knew that their lines felt unstable, that every decision was fraught with unseen threats. Marek's ingenuity was about to face its ultimate test. One morning, a German patrol spotted him at work. He had been chalking arrows along a snowbank, unaware that a scout had returned to double-check a route. The scout froze, staring at the small boy crouched in the snow, chalk in hand. For a heartbeat, the boy's heart stopped. The scout hesitated, then walked away without alerting anyone. Marek exhaled slowly, knowing that one mistake could have ended everything. This close encounter reminded him that his victory was fragile. Each mark he made had to be precise, each track meticulously placed. The Germans were tense, paranoid, and growing increasingly cautious, but the illusion was still holding. By April, Marek had perfected the network. The Germans were retreating from critical valleys, leaving behind artillery, supplies, and fortified positions. Allied forces moving through the region encountered less resistance than anticipated. Villages that might have been razed were spared. Mech's silent orchestration was saving lives, both civilian and military. And yet in the quiet moments, Mech felt the weight of what he had done. The snow-covered valleys, the empty barns, the abandoned roads, all were evidence of his cunning, but also a reminder of how thin the line between survival and discovery could be. He was still a refugee, still a child, still exposed to the very army he manipulated. The final phase of his deception was about to unfold. The Germans, increasingly desperate and wary, would soon take extreme measures to verify the supply routes, unknowingly walking into the intricate trap Mech had laid. The culmination of his ingenuity, courage, and understanding of human fear was approaching, and it would decide the fate of entire battalions in the Vosges Mountains. April 12, 1945, a date that would remain etched in the memories of the few who witnessed it, though the world would never know the truth. The Vosges Mountains were shrouded in low-hanging clouds, mist curling through the valleys like specters. German forces, already on edge from weeks of inconsistent intelligence, prepared to send a full reconnaissance battalion into the southern valley, precisely where Mech's phantom supply route converged. Mech had spent the previous nights reinforcing the illusion. He dragged planks to simulate wagon tracks, chalked elaborate arrows pointing toward hidden depots, and scattered broken crates and branches to suggest abandoned munitions. Every detail was meant to be convincing at first glance, confusing on second, and ultimately impossible to verify without hours of inspection. As dawn approached, Mech crouched behind a collapsed barn, his small body trembling not from cold, but from anticipation. Every footstep in the snow, every murmur of voices, every metallic clang from the scouts' gear made his heart pound like a drum. This was the culmination of weeks of silent orchestration. One misstep, one discovery, and the army he had manipulated could turn its fury upon him. The German battalion entered the valley cautiously. Hauptmann Vogel, frustrated but determined, led the formation, scrutinizing every mark in the snow and mud. Tracks split in multiple directions, chalk arrows pointed to phantom depots, and scattered branches suggested abandoned supplies. Each layer of deception had been carefully calculated to appear natural. The scouts moved slowly, recording every detail. They argued over the plausibility of the movements. Some insisted the valley was too heavily defended for a single enemy column. Others doubted their own eyes, and Vogel, already tense from previous reports, hesitated. Mech watched, invisible, as panic slowly took hold. The scouts began requesting reinforcements. Vogel ordered units to hold positions elsewhere. Supply lines were rerouted. Orders to attack or advance were postponed indefinitely. The German battalion, trained and disciplined, was paralyzed, manipulated by the simple markings of a 15-year-old refugee. Hours later, the officers convened. They pored over the maps, discussing what they believed were enemy supply movements through multiple valleys. They feared encirclement, feared ambushes, feared that the Phantom Army was larger than their own divisions. Every decision was influenced by Mech's handiwork. By evening, German forces began to retreat from the valley entirely. Artillery was abandoned. Vehicles were relocated. Troops pulled back along safer routes, leaving strategic positions empty. Allied units arriving the next morning found roads clear, trenches abandoned, and defensive positions deserted. The enemy had fled without firing a shot, all in response to a child's chalk arrows and staged tracks. Mech remained in hiding, exhausted, trembling, yet fully aware of the consequences of his actions. The retreat had spared villages from destruction. It had prevented bloodshed on a scale that could have been catastrophic. And yet, he also knew the fragile line he had walked. One mistake could have led to discovery, capture, or death. In the aftermath, villagers began whispering about the mysterious, guiding hand that had led the Germans away. Some suspected local resistance fighters. Some speculated about intelligence from the Allies. Mech said nothing. He simply returned to the barns, the forests, the quiet corners where he had observed, calculated, and drawn his phantom supply lines. For the Germans, the retreat was a mystery, an unexplained failure of intelligence, a cautionary tale of the dangers of overestimating the enemy. For the Allies, the reduced resistance in the Vosges facilitated their advance, accelerating the liberation of occupied territories. And for Marek, the experience left a permanent imprint. The realization that even the smallest, most overlooked individual could shape the course of history through courage, creativity, and observation. Yet Marek's story, like many of the unseen acts of war, remained almost entirely hidden. The world would never know how a single refugee boy, armed with nothing more than chalk, a plank, and a keen understanding of human behavior, had created a phantom army capable of forcing the retreat of a real one. Spring 1945 arrived slowly in the Vosges Mountains, melting the snow and revealing the scars of war. Valleys that had been strategic battlegrounds were now quiet, except for the distant hum of Allied vehicles advancing westward. The German retreat, hastened by Marek's phantom supply routes, had left behind a ghost landscape, abandoned artillery, empty trenches, and supply depots that never held a single bullet or barrel of fuel. For Marek, the immediate danger had passed, but the war's shadows did not disappear. Refugees still huddled in barns, ration lines remained long, and the future was uncertain. Yet amidst this uncertainty, a quiet pride grew inside him, a knowledge that his actions had saved lives, disrupted enemy plans, and shaped events far beyond what any child should have imagined. He returned to the barns and forests where he had worked for weeks, tracing the paths one last time with fading chalk. Now they were marks of memory, not deception. Villagers whispered of the mysterious force that had forced the German retreat. Some speculated about the Allied advance, others about resistance fighters, but none suspected a child refugee. Marek said nothing. His victory was silent, hidden, almost invisible, but it mattered. In the following months, as the war drew to a close, Marek and his mother continued to survive among the displaced. The boy's experience had given him a new understanding. War was not only fought with weapons, but with observation, intuition, and daring ingenuity. Even a child, overlooked and underestimated, could wield influence over armies, decisions, and outcomes. Decades later, historians would piece together fragments of the events in the Vosges, noting the unusual German withdrawal and the reports of phantom convoys. But Marek's name would remain largely unknown. Like so many children of war whose courage reshaped history quietly, his story existed in whispers, in archives, in the memories of those who survived. Yet for Marek himself, the lesson was deeply personal. He had discovered the power of resourcefulness, courage, and subtlety. He had learned that fear could be redirected, that perception could shape reality, and that sometimes the smallest, most vulnerable person could change the course of events in ways that seemed impossible. The Vosges Mountains returned to their calm. The forests reclaimed the tracks and arrows. The barns and roads bore no sign of the elaborate deception, but somewhere in the snow-melt rivers and hidden valleys, the memory of a child who tricked an army lingered. Marek's story is a testament to the courage, intelligence, and humanity of those often overlooked in history, the children who survived, adapted, and shaped the world in silence. And in the quiet, the mountains still whisper that a single child, armed with nothing but chalk and imagination, once turned fear into strategy and illusion into reality.